I'm Ines Pagani, I'm the Vice President of the Francophone Student Association at Thornton, l'association étudiante francophone. I've been asked to welcome you to Elizabeth May's Community Matters Tour and to remind us that we are meeting on Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe territory. It's also my pleasure to introduce Sudbury's Green Party candidate, Bill Crumplin, who will introduce the Green Party leader. Bill Crumplin est un professeur en études dans l'environnement à l'Université Laurentienne et depuis quelques temps, il transmet ses messages environnementaux à l'extérieur de la salle de classe également. L'année dernière, il s'est présenté pour le Parti vert dans la circonscription de Nickel Belt pour les élections provinciales et il s'est aussi présenté aux élections municipales en octobre dernier. He's a professor of environmental studies at Laurentian University and has been taking environmental and green economy messages outside the university's classroom for a while. Last year, he ran for the Green Party in Nickel Belt riding and in the provincial election, and he made a bid to be mayor in last October's municipal election too. Je crois pouvoir parler pour les étudiants en disant que nous serions chanceux d'avoir quelqu'un comme lui pour nous représenter. He's looking forward to the federal campaign and hopes that you will vote green this election. Here's Bill Crumplin.
Okay, I usually like to be off the cuff and just talk, but I've got some really important things that I want to say because we've got a very important guest in our city today. Now, it is more than wonderful to be here today with so many people to meet Elizabeth May and hear her vision of our country, our environment, and our economy. Don't ignore the economic component of the Green Platform. There's much I can say about Elizabeth, but I will try to keep things relatively short because we are actually here to hear you, and she's also here. We're here to hear her, and we're also here to hear you at the same time because we will be having a question and answer period because Elizabeth is, the title of the tour is Community Matters, and she wants to know what we in Sudbury are concerned about. Now, but before I formally introduce Elizabeth, I wish to acknowledge some other Green Party officials. Because I'm here now because of a lot of work that's been done by a lot of people who've come before me. And I think it's important that I mention them. And I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. Steve, May, and I have been trying to keep track and make sure we got the full list. Now we have Casey Lalonde, who's the CEO of the Sudbury Riding Association. There's your top of the stairs. Aaron Manichak, who is the Nickel Belt Riding CEO. He was... Hi. There we go, up there. We have quite a contingent from Nipissing. We have Scott Haig, who is the CEO. We've got CEO Preston Smith, Membership Chair Terry Bedard, Terry there, up there, Volunteer Chair Dave Thompson.
Right here.
Right here, okay, with the
Smile.
iPad.
Smile.
Okay, and Shadow Cabinet Chair Christine Golden. The CEO of the Sudbury Riding Association, Max Chapman from Algoma, Manitoula, and Kapuskasing.
He's a nominated candidate.
Yes, he's the nominated candidate. So, and I got to know him a little bit last night. We went out for beverages. And we also have Gio McLean here from Sault Ste. Marie. Gio, okay. Chris Hard, did Chris actually make it? He said he was coming. He's from Nickel Belt. And we also have a third Nickel Belt candidate, or nominee rather, is Erica Handel, but she's in absence. She's not here today. So thank you for helping me with those announcements. And what I also want to do is, did Al Sizer make it? Al, are you here? He said he was coming from City Council. And Danielle Giroux, president of College Boreal. Danielle, did you sneak in on us? Okay. I do know that a couple of my colleagues are here. John Gunn, from the director of Living with Lakes, LA Living with Lakes, is here. Peter Beckett is here. Peter was instrumental in reading efforts in Sudbury. There. Well, thank you very much. If there's anybody I missed, I'm sorry, but thank you so much. So, the official part of my talk here. Elizabeth May, as you know, is the leader of the Green Party of Canada and is its first elected member of Parliament. She represents Saanich and Gulf Islands in southern Vancouver Island. She's an environmentalist, writer, activist, and lawyer who has a long record and as a dedicated advocate for social justice, for the environment, for human rights, and this is critically important for pragmatic, sustainable economic solutions. She was born in Connecticut, moved to Nova Scotia with her family in 1973. She grew up working in her family's small business, restaurant and gift shop on the Cabot Trail. I love the Cabot Trail. And she first became known in the Canadian media in the mid-1970s through her leadership as a volunteer in the grassroots movement against proposed aerial insecticide spraying on forests near her home on Cape Breton Island. Her efforts helped prevent aerial insecticide spraying from ever occurring in Nova Scotia. Not bad. In June 2006, Elizabeth stepped down as executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, a post she had held since 1989, to run for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. She was successful in her bid and was elected as the Green Party's 10th leader at its national convention in 2006. In the 2011 election, Elizabeth made history by being the first Green Party to yes. And she was re-elected by the constituents of Saanich and the Gulf Islands in 2015. Now, under Elizabeth's leadership and guidance, mentorship, and it's been interesting how much I've learned from her in just a couple of hours today. It's, you know, the learning curve has been high, and I owe you a great lot of thanks. But some of the things that have happened, remarkable progress that has happened, include, but it's not limited to, we now have 3 Green MLAs in BC where they hold the balance of power. That happened in 2018. We have in 2018, we had 3 Greens were elected to New Brunswick, including the New Brunswick Green leader, David Kuhn. Also in 2018, but in Ontario this time, we had Michael Schreiner, the leader of the Ontario Green Party, from Guelph, be elected into the Ontario legislature. We had 9 MLAs elected in PEI, and they're now the official opposition in a minority parliament in Charlottetown. Paul Manley, you may recall, was recently elected as the Green Party candidate, or the Green Party candidate's second MP ever from the riding of Nanaimo, Ladysmith. And yesterday we were joined in the House by Gary Nantel, MP for Longueuil St. Hubert. So as good as I am, you know, on one hand, that means, you know, we've got 3 MPs now in the House, which is pretty impressive. And this woman is, if not totally, largely responsible. Now, she's also an officer of the Order of Canada. In 2005, she was recognized by the United Nations as one of the world's leading female environmentalists. And in 2010, she was named by Newsweek magazine as one of the world's most influential women. She's respected across party lines. She was chosen by her fellow MPs as Parliamentarian of the Year 2012, Arts Working MP in 2013, and the Best Public Speaker in both 2013 and 2014. As a tireless representative for constituents and Canadians, is that enough? Okay, sorry. All right. without further ado, then, I've never been given the hook before. Professor never gets the hook, but it's now politics.
I know. It's so sweet, but it's just I'm too old. There's too much.
There's never too much.
Thank you, Bill. I'm mindful too that there's a lot of people standing up, and I'm wondering if anyone who sees a bench space, you think to yourself, there's room on this bench here for me to invite someone else to sit near me. So if any of you see a spot near you, would you put your hand up? So before we get started, because my standard speech is about 2 hours, you'll get tired. Just checking in case anyone wants to grab one of those spots. Don't be shy. If you want to move into a spot in there, there's lots of room. Go ahead, Max. I was thinking of older people, but you take a seat. You just do that. Anybody else? Honestly, it's such a thrill to be here in Sudbury. I've been here loads of times. Good. Keep your hand, you've got a spot next to you. Honestly, it's really better for people to be sitting down. I'm overwhelmed by the turnout here tonight. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to make a shout out to Steve May. We're actually, as far as we know, we're not related. And I'm sure we both want to make the point that neither of us have anything to do with Theresa May.
Yeah.
May or may not. You never know. Anyway. I wanted today to tell you a little bit about why I'm here and then turn it over to you for questions. This is a Community Matters tour. As you've heard, this is, by my count, the 33rd community on this tour. So I've held public meetings like this in every province and one of the 3 territories, towns, big and big cities. We did most of the travel low carbon by via rail, which also means we arrive most places really late. It also means that when you get off the train, the next one's in 4 days. So it's true. So we started in Vancouver actually the first part of the tour I left Ottawa, we took the train to Montreal, then up to Quebec, and then the train overnight into New Brunswick. And then we fortunately, a lot of Canadians now own electric vehicles and they love showing them off. So I got a lot of rides in the equivalent of a spaceship. A lot of people own Teslas and are happy to give me a ride, which is fun. Which reminds me actually of my husband. A lot of things remind me of my husband these days. We only got married in April, and a bunch of volunteers in the EV club made our wedding their Earth Day project, because we got married on Earth Day. So I did want to tell you that I just got this message. I knew that John, my husband, John Kidder, had a big family connection to Sudbury because my husband grew up in the mining business and it started generationally. So his father was in mining and so was his grandfather. I know a lot of stories about his father because he was the explosives guy on a lot of mine sites, which is why my husband, his sister was Margot Kidder, remember, right? John and Margot were born in Yellowknife where their father was mining there. They lived in Set Eel. They lived in Labrador City when it wasn't a community, it's just a mine site. But John's grandfather, this is what I want to tell you, Sidney Jesse Kidder, was the first manager of the Inco mines in Sudbury. So I do have, through marriage, I have really deep roots in Sudbury. I'm going to hang on to them. And yeah, he says his grandfather, Sidney Jesse Kidder, started at the Helen mine first and mostly working in places like Wawa and Algoma in the 30s. So, and then before being hired by Inco, he'd been managing the asbestos mine in Bedford, Quebec. So anyway, my husband would be here, except he's running for Parliament. It's just so crazy. We just got married and we never see each other. So he's running in Mission Matsui, Fraser Canyon. In case any of you know anyone there, please put in a good word for me. I'd appreciate it. So back to what I was saying. What made me think of it too is we got this tour. John helped me and was on most of the legs of the trip with me by train across the country. And the goal was primarily, and remains tonight, to listen to Canadians right across the country, from towns as small as where my husband lives in Ashcroft, which is 1,000 people in interior BC, to Montreal, to Halifax, to Charlottetown, to places like Fort Capel, Saskatchewan, where we had a tremendous forum, to Regina, Brandon, Portage La Prairie. I won't go through the whole list. It's been extraordinary, really rewarding. And one of the things that I want to share with everybody here, because so often people in politics these days think they can get ahead by trying to convince one part of Canada that the rest of Canada doesn't like them. I think it's extremely unfortunate. I know now from personal experience, and one can always say that the people who show up for an open invitation share their thoughts when it's the leader of the Green Party who's there to listen to them. It's obviously, but not necessarily, people come and ask challenging questions. But what comes through loud and clear when you travel this incredibly blessed country is that we aren't different. Wherever we live, we're Canadians. Nous sommes dans chaque parti, chaque région, chaque province, nous sommes famille. Une famille forte et nous partageons les mêmes valeurs. So our values that pull us together have a lot to do with the title of this work. Community. We are a country that really pulls together as communities. Somebody's barn burns down, people show up. Somebody's house is flooded, friends come around. We are a country of many, many communities. I think it was Joe Clark who called us a community of communities. We really are one country, one people, one family, and we do pull together well. And don't let anyone tell you differently, that there's some parts of Canada that are somehow or other less Canadian than the rest of us. We're really pretty cool as a country. I think we really, I when I'm talking to small children to describe what it is to be a Canadian citizen, I started asking them if they'd seen Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And they say, you know what, if you're living in Canada, you were born in Canada, your family brought you to Canada, like my parents brought me to Canada, you got the golden ticket. And yeah, we got the golden ticket. So, but that isn't to say there aren't things we need to improve. There are many things we can improve. But I think we need to be more mindful of how, when you look around the world, is there any other country you want to be in? You look at countries around the world that are plagued with much larger degrees of social inequity. One of the things that we have going for us that we have to protect, and I think we have to protect it fairly fiercely, is ensuring that we don't develop, which we already have. I mean, a handful of families in this country have most of the wealth, but the degree of social inequality is much worse in the United States than here, and we see the results of that. You look at something like, we have a coming climate emergency, which is global, and we're in it, but we experience it as local climate emergencies. And one of the things that struck me as I went across the country, and I would never have really figured this out for myself because it wasn't really written in the media, but when you have a climate emergency, there's some things that are really remarkably shared experiences from different kinds of events. So in my own riding of Saanich Gulf Islands, on December 20th of last year, just before Christmas, we had a windstorm that was the scariest thing people have lived through. When I had my town halls after the windstorm, people said, I still feel like I have PTSD. I mean, the sound of the trees cracking, the way the wind was blowing, I thought our house was going to blow away. And when the storm was over, trees were down everywhere. Galliano Island, Main Island, Salisbury Island, most of the Southern Gulf Islands, the trees were down, so you couldn't get in your car and drive anywhere. The roads are blocked. The power's off. And guess what else we lose in climate emergencies? The landlines didn't work, and neither did the cell phones. And in community after community, small places, number one, people are smart, they know it's against the law to take a chainsaw, go out and cut up a tree when the power lines are down. Fortunately, they also knew there's no power. So they just went ahead and got out the chainsaws and started clearing the roads so they could go check on the vulnerable. Because this is right before, this power outage and lack of cell phones and lack of landlines lasted 10 days, right through Christmas. And everybody in the communities went out and checked on everybody else. Made sure that, you know, there was some, and Galliano, there was one dear lady who was in her 90s and by herself for Christmas. Check on them, bring them into it. And then they went around and they figured, okay, who's got a generator? So on one of the islands, it was the community center. Everybody brought the food that was melting in their freezer, get it to that, you know, and the people who run their own, the Campbell's lamb business had a lot of frozen lamb. They had big freezers, so people brought stuff to them. Every community rallied around and organized. When I was in Ashcroft, my husband's community, I heard about what had happened to them the summer before last when they were on evacuation warning. And suddenly it's the same story, we've never thought of it. Hanging in a valley where the smoke settles and the fires are all around, there's only one road out of town, and the deputy fire chief told me what happened. She said, we were waiting for the word if we had to evacuate or not. You couldn't see across the street for smoke. And power was out, landlines were out, cell phones didn't work. The deputy fire chief told me to prepare for what's coming. I know we've been talking about it, and the fire department's going to get a really big bell. Start thinking, okay, what do you do with it? And then the same story from the flooded areas. We went to visit New Brunswick. Power out, loud kill. So there's something about community that really matters when you're in that much difficulty. As some of my constituents said, we realized no one was coming for us. We had to organize. And when you think about what we fail, I think, to appreciate what an asset it is to the health of our communities, that we have something called social cohesion. And it's measured in all kinds of ways. There's a wonderful book by two British academics called The Spirit Level, which speaks to this issue about what does it matter when you really trust your neighbors. They've done studies, surveys, and in the United States of America, it's astonishing how few people, the question is, if someone knocked at your door and you weren't expecting anyone, would you go to the door? A very, very large proportion of people in the US said they wouldn't go to the door. Canadians also said, yeah, I'll go to the door, see who it is, might need help. For me, one of the great examples of how we are, and these are important values we share that we need to protect, is the difference between the horrific natural disaster that occurred in Fort McMurray with the fires, which are also a climate event, and the climate event in New Orleans when they had Hurricane Katrina. You can picture in your mind's eye, because we were all glued to the TV set. I don't know how many of you had relatives and friends in Fort Mac, but that community was spectacular. Nobody was left behind, nobody panicked. The first responders stayed there on the road directing traffic. If somebody's car ran out of gas with all the lanes just going south, if someone's car ran out of gas, they'd push it to the side of the road, and everybody in that car could get into somebody else's car. Everybody shared, everybody took care of everybody else. In Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, more than half of the New Orleans Fire Department took off, not fire department, firefighters stayed put. Sorry, I know the firefighters stayed put because I know firefighters. Not that I don't know policemen and they're wonderful, but in New Orleans, most of the police force left before the dams gave way and they drove off in their police cars. And we know what happened to the African American community that got left behind and then were blocked at roads. If we had had that kind of, the social cohesion that we have in Fort McMurray, or I think any Canadian community, should be counted. We don't count it in our GDP. We don't measure it in terms of the wealth of this nation. But our communities and our care and concern and compassion for each other are one of the things that's why being in Canada is the golden ticket. Our relationships, our friendships, our caring, our communities, the things we do together, pitching in, volunteers, whatever it is, we have great wealth in the fact that we have a more egalitarian society, and we can do much, much more to ensure that everyone is included, everyone is welcome, no one is poor, no one goes without. We have the capacity to do that. And that's one of the things I want to talk about in this election coming up. What we could do in a country that's already blessed to make sure that no one is left behind, no one's left out, and that we can prepare for and not only survive, but thrive in a post-carbon world where we decide we're prepared. By the way, I don't think anybody's coming for us. I would love our governments to stand up, and if I'm Prime Minister at the end of the next election, which by the way, you can smile, it's okay. I don't think it's going to happen. But if I were Prime Minister at the end of the next election, we'd have a plan for dealing with the climate crisis, get through it, and make sure that our economy is thriving. I visited a whole bunch of businesses today in Sudbury and academic research agencies and think tanks to say, look, if we're going to deal with the climate crisis, we need a whole lot more basic metals. We're going to need lead, we're going to need copper, we're going to need nickel. And we better be developing and mining that in a way that is consistent with reducing greenhouse gases. So we know that there are ways that this society in Canada can both go past and get away from the disasters that await us if we don't change course and move off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And that's what I've been trying to talk about in the election campaign. And then the third part, of course, at all times is talking about, so we talk about responding to the climate crisis, surviving and thriving. We talk about social justice, to have a fairer society with pharmacare, with eliminating tuition, with guaranteed livable income, with the things that will make us a fairer society, and ensuring that we actually address truth, justice, and reconciliation. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples must be the law of the land in this country. That's all I had to say to start things off. Gives you a bit of a flavor of what we are as a party, what we care about. I need to know what you care about. I'm not sure if there are other working mics in the space, so if not, we do know that voices carry. So if anyone wants to shout out a question, I'll try to keep track of names, but I do try to write everything down so I have a record of what I heard in every community. But I'll write down your name, listen to your question, and answer it as best I can. And if I can get help, Bill, if I'm missing people whose hands are up, let me know. But right now I see a young woman right there, her hand is up. What's your name? Chanel, what's your question?
My question is, what will you do for animal rights? Like reevaluating Bill S-214, cruelty-free cosmetic act, ban fur farms in Canada, Calgary stampede, put an end to that, animal exploitation, zoo exhibition, etc.
Okay, thank you, Chanel. I'm really proud of, as an MP, for most of my 8 years in Parliament, working by myself, I'm really pleased that I actually did get 2 pieces of legislation passed into law. In the first Parliament, when Harper had the majority, I got passed unanimously, actually, a bill to deal with, to create a national framework around Lyme disease. But the second one I want to mention is directly related to animal rights. The bill I sponsored through the House of Commons, which didn't get unanimous support, but we got it through the Senate and the House, and it's the bill that bans keeping whales in captivity. And that one, a lot of the animal rights groups have correctly noted that this is the first bill in Canadian history that deals with the individual animal and what's in the best interest of the individual animal in portions of that bill. So it's an important step forward. We also banned, it's not quite an animal rights bill, but we also managed to get through the bill on banning shark finning. I certainly support ending animal testing in cosmetics, Bill S-214. We also need to go back and look at the criminal code, because right now, cruelty to animals is treated as though animals are property. And I talked to a lot of police chiefs in this country who are, this is one of the great things about being leader of a federal party. You get to meet all kinds of really cool people and they tell you what they think about things. And police chiefs that I talked to, and policemen, are very concerned that we don't have stiff enough sentences or investigation of cruelty to animals, because in their experience, even if it's young people who are torturing an animal, that's the kind of person who later on will attack a person. So sadism towards an animal is a really worrying thing, and we don't treat it as seriously as we should, because we're treating animals as property, which is wrong. So we need to amend the criminal code completely. Our platform has a lot of provisions around intensive livestock agriculture in terms of more space, treating animals with compassion, and eating a lot less meat, but recognizing that animals in a lot of other contexts, on small family farms, and sold to friends and neighbors and so on. There's a lot of good, healthy ways to eat meat out there, but intensive livestock agriculture is one of them. And the last thing I wanted to say was, the Calgary Stampede. I go to the Calgary Stampede every year, and I always get a lot of grief because the community of Calgary is important to me. The city of Calgary is important to me. And most of what happens in Calgary during Stampede has nothing to do with the rodeo. So I don't go to the rodeo. I go every year and explain to the Calgary Herald and the newspapers there that the Green Party calls for the end of calf roping because it's cruel, and an end to the chuck wagon races because the horses it's unacceptable how many horses die every year in chuck wagon races and they can't fix it. But I will say out loud, Chanel, don't get mad at me, I love Calgary Stampede. I really like cooking pancakes. I'm good at it. People line up at my station. I used to run a restaurant, as Bill mentioned, so I'm not meaning to treat it with any kind of lack of seriousness. It's just that most of what's cool at Calgary Stampede is what the communities do. Another, the coolest thing this year in relation to Indigenous rights, I was there for the opening of, it's always struck me as kind of weird, like it's culturally weird that it's Calgary Stampede event, and then they suddenly bring in the Indian princesses on horseback with crowns made of beads and stuff. This is kind of off-putting, this strikes me. But I went to the official inauguration of what they used to call Indian Camp at Calgary Stampede. This year, it was renamed, an appropriate name, Elbow River Camp. And Indigenous leadership, and particularly elders, spoke to the history of the Calgary Stampede in the era, in the 1920s and 1930s, when the government of Canada had made powwows illegal. They made traditional ceremony illegal. The history of the Calgary Stampede is that the organizers said, these are important events here. And when the federal government told the organizers of the Calgary Stampede, it's illegal if you let Indigenous people come hold powwows. They said, no, it's not. It's part. So the Indigenous leadership at this particular ceremony said a lot of traditional ceremony and ritual might have been lost, but everyone Indigenous around Calgary in that era knew that they could come to Stampede and have a summer of powwows that was legally protected from the federal government. So that put the Stampede in a different light for me. But anyway, animal rights are important to us as Greens. We represent people from across the country who are also hunters and trappers and livestock producers. But we try to find the right balance that we must protect animal rights because it's a changed consciousness that we need about the natural world. And it makes us better people. As a society that protects its most vulnerable, it's always going to be a better society. And our children have to be protected. Not that I'm equating children with animals, but we don't protect our children. We don't protect animals. We need to protect all living beings from wanton cruelty. Thank you. Who's next with a question? Yes. The lady at the top of the stairs.
I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts of Extinction Rebellion out of the Valley.
Can you say it a little louder?
I just wondered if you have any thoughts about Extinction Rebellion.
Oh, Extinction Rebellion. Okay, what was your name? Dale? I love Extinction Rebellion. Now, I don't know how many of you, just out of curiosity, have heard of Extinction Rebellion? No, it's not, it's some of you. I'm much more drawn to the power and the impact of Greta Thunberg and the school student strikes. Mm-hmm. They're mobilizing in a way that may be less threatening to people. And to be led by our children is certainly humbling for people my age and older. I'm 65, I think. I mean, this little girl from Sweden, last August, it's only a little bit more than a year ago, she was 15 years old. She left on a Friday of school and started Fridays for the Future and sitting outside of the Parliament in Stockholm on Fridays. And now she's leading a movement of millions of young people who are too young to vote. It's deeply shaming and moving and powerful. She also has a clarity of her voice. I don't know how many of you have seen her video of her talk at a TED Talk, where she talks about how she doesn't think she could be as clear about the climate threat if she wasn't on the spectrum. That her autism has made her see the world as black and white, and she can't understand what's wrong with the rest of us, that we think there's shades of gray. That we can know that we're on the verge of a cataclysmic climate disaster that could destroy the future, destroy human civilization within a lifetime as someone as young as Greta. and still get up in the morning and go to work and act like everything's normal. She said, I can't do that. I got to Sudbury's line to say, I don't want adults to give me hope. I want you to panic. I want you to panic the way I panic, as though our house is on fire, because our house is on fire. And that I want to say to everybody who's terrified, okay, so the response of grown-ups isn't to say, well, I think the fire's behind the upstairs bedroom, and the game is on, I don't want to miss it. You know, we always would say the responsible thing, stay calm, everybody get out of the house, call 911, I've got the fire extinguishers, we're going to put out the fire. Now what Extinction Rebellion does is it takes another step by saying, I've got to put my body on the line to wake people up. And so Extinction Rebellion has been very strong in the UK, with lots of people being willing to face arrest, block bridges to get attention to the issue. And I certainly applaud anybody who's finding any way to draw attention to the issue, but I think anything we can do in Canada to support our young people in their student climate strikes, we should. You were adding something, sorry.
But I think what it seems to me is hopefully it's a different economic system.
Mm-hmm.
And is that exactly, how do you see that as well?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it exactly that Extinction Rebellion was proposing a different economic system. That's certainly something that we hear from many people, that the source of the climate crisis is capitalism. I think for me the issue is different. I think the source of the climate crisis is greed and indifference. That capitalism properly regulated isn't a problem at all. I mean, it's the problem right now is that we're living under global corporate rule, and that big oil controls a lot of decision making. That's not right. So in a democracy with proper regulation, I mean, you could say if it's not capitalism, if it's communism, well, the People's Republic of China contributes a lot of pollution. It's not capitalist. The problem is a growth model that says unending economic growth is what we need. Regardless of what the ism is, we have to live within the limits of the carrying capacity of this planet. We're at the limit. We have to change what we're doing. Or as Greta Thunberg says, we have to pull the emergency brake. But we can do it in a way, because if we did decide that our first problem is to change our economic system, we don't have time before the window of opportunity to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. The window will close on that opportunity well before we have a prayer of changing our economic system. So to issues like nonviolent civil disobedience, obviously I support nonviolent civil disobedience since I was arrested blockading a pipeline. I'm not urging that everybody run out and do it. It's the hardest thing I ever did. But getting outside your comfort zone sometimes can be, well, if it's an act of solidarity with Indigenous nations who've asked you to do it, I don't think you really have a choice if you said you're going to act in solidarity with Indigenous nations. I just wondered, just as another point of curiosity, I asked for hands up for who had heard of Extinction Rebellion. How many people have heard of Greta Thunberg? Good, almost everybody. This kid, oh my God. So she's coming across the Atlantic right now on a sailboat. September 23rd is when the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has called for a global climate summit in New York in conjunction with the usual annual UN General Assembly meeting of all nations. And the horror of it is Canada will miss the meeting because we're in an election. So I've called for a campaign strike. I've asked Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer and Max Bernier, parenthetical, God help us, but anyway, I've asked them to agree that we should go on a campaign strike. That, prime ministers don't usually go to a meeting when they're in the middle of an election, but we really should. All opposition leaders should make this a non-partisan issue and say Canada should be there to vastly increase the target. The target we currently have is unchanged since 6 months before the Paris negotiations started. It's unchanged from when Stephen Harper was in power. Despite the Liberals saying that they were going to be so much better, they haven't got a plan to meet the Harper target, which is exactly 50% of what we need to do. So I'd like to see our Prime Minister go to New York and say, we're on board, we get it. We want to be part of a solution that moves all nations to what needs to be done based on the advice of the world scientists. So I'm sorry, Gail, I went on a bit at your question, but I hope it was helpful. Who's got the next question? I'm going to ask the gentleman right in front of me, and then I'll go to the lady in purple, and then who's in the back row? Okay, he'll be third, so you go 1, 2, 3. Yes, sir.
When it comes to social issues, what's your take on the poverty, addiction, homelessness, and affordable housing?
What's your name?
Charles.
Okay, Charles's question is, what is my take and the party take on poverty, addiction,
Homelessness,
Homelessness.
and affordable housing.
and social housing? Well, first of all, we're the first party in Canada committed to eliminating poverty, and we can do it. We are committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals that Canada says it's committed to that were put forward by the United Nations. They're not just to do things in developing countries, they're also for us. We have to hold the mirror up to us, and again, where are the things we can improve? So in terms of, we need to eliminate poverty. It can be done. We have an anti-poverty caucus, by the way, in Parliament, speaking of doing things in a nonpartisan fashion. And I think the parliamentarians gathered around those tables, even though they can't speak for their parties, agree that we need guaranteed livable income for all, so we eliminate poverty in this country. Then we need to wrap up all it'll take a while to negotiate it, because to make it feasible economically, we have to wrap up and pull the plug on a number of shame-based programs that perpetuate poverty, like welfare and certain of the disability programs. The ones that say to someone, oh, if you're a single mom and your boyfriend's moved in on you, they're snooping around and you lose your benefits. What kind of world is that? So we have to get rid of those programs, and then every single Canadian, it's really easy to administer. There's nobody supervising to find out if you deserve a check. Every Canadian gets a check, and if you're a tax-paying Canadian, it comes in and out in the wash. It eliminates underground economy, because people who have a fear of being reported that they've done some work because they'll be clawing back from their benefits are very likely to say, pay me in cash. And I know a lot of us have done, oh yeah, okay, but what that does is not only perpetuates a cycle of poverty, it perpetuates an underclass where people don't feel they can be proud of their earnings and paying taxes and being part of society. Now, when we get rid of poverty, and also we believe that housing is a right, and we need to invest in social housing and address the affordability housing crisis, which is a market-based problem for people who are earning an income and can't afford a house, which is a bigger problem in other parts of Canada than it is here, but it's a big problem everywhere. Then we can focus on if someone's on the street, even when they can put a roof over their head and they're getting a check, well then that's a mental health or an addiction issue that we have to deal with. So we have to also address as an urgent, we would declare it a public health emergency, the opioid crisis. It started certainly with fentanyl coming into BC and spreading across the country. It has spread across the country. And I don't call those deaths overdoses. Those are poisonings. And we need to address it as an issue of contamination and deal with it as a health issue and a criminal justice issue. So the lady with the purple shirt, you're next. I didn't get your name. Emily, thank you. Well, first of all, our approach to electricity for all the things that want to be electrified is to make sure the grid is 100% renewable green energy. Clearly, nuclear isn't. That doesn't mean we've crunched the numbers, and believe me, when you see our platform, it's really hard to cut 60% of greenhouse gases against 2005 levels by 2030. We can do it, but we can't do it if we prematurely shut down the nukes in Ontario. We wouldn't build any new ones, they make no sense. As far as nuclear waste, you'll be so thrilled to know who now controls so much of nuclear waste is SNC Lavalin. What could go wrong? So we do need to deal with nuclear waste, it's a serious issue. The Green Party favors putting it in an irretrievable state. A lot of the people who have an interest in perpetuating the nuclear industry have an interest in not solving the nuclear waste problem. They like keeping it in basically swimming pools that you can access because they want to go back and take the spent fuel rods and take the irradiated materials. It's very, very highly radioactive, but it could be, I mean, they could brand it pretty green, call it recycling, for reactors that could actually produce a lot more plutonium through neutron bombardment. So the current spent fuel from Canada reactors is all right now still in a retrievable state. We'd rather see it classified, put in a state. I mean, these are toxic radionuclides that will continue to be dangerous for 250 million years. So imagining that we have the knowledge for how to deal with them is hubris. We shouldn't be producing more, but we need to put them in a state where they can't contribute to nuclear proliferation. So classifying and in concrete and in irretrievable state and buried is the best we can do, and we shouldn't produce any more. But the nuclear industry on this, which is now owned partly, it's a consortium, which SNC Lavalin is the largest. Did you all know that?
Nope.
That Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, AECL, the Crown Corporation, that sucked up $40 billion in subsidies from the people of Canada since the 1950s, was broken into pieces and sold when Harper was Prime Minister, and SNC Lavalin got the, put together a consortium that now owns AECL. So, I won't go on about this, I could get distracted, in a large rant. But in terms of electric vehicles, we want to ban an internal combustion engine pretty quickly. A lot of what we're going to see would happen because the technologies are disruptive in the sense that they're unstoppable. Unfortunately, governments are trying to protect the fossil fuel industry, particularly because of the, as I mentioned, it's the big oil. Our economy can do very well shifting away from fossil fuels and into different technologies. But we're really in a situation now where as electric vehicles take off and people start realizing, as some of my friends in Southern Gulf Islands, I think we're pretty lucky, but we can get enough sunshine on our roof to power our vehicle. So I'm in an apartment building, so my plug-in is always a problem to find a plug because my landlord doesn't let me have a plug. Never mind. But for people who own their own home and put solar panels on the roof, I've got friends already who live in the Cowichan Valley and Vancouver Island who power their entire home from the solar panels on their roof and drive their car based on the sunshine from their roof. The reality of renewable energy is that once you have the infrastructure in place, the marginal cost for energy becomes zero. Now that is really interesting. And if we democratize energy while we're at it, in other words, not letting Ontario Hydro or other big monopolies make the decisions, then we end up having our own ability in our own communities to generate our own energy, whether it's wind or geothermal or solar or combinations with district energy. It's a very exciting future, and one that is, the air is cleaner, our costs go down, and we're told we should be afraid of this. I'm afraid of what happens if we don't do it. So, yes, right behind you. I know I was going to go to the gentleman in the back, but you look urgent.
But what about Northern Ontario, they get 6 to 8 feet of snow on their roofs, and how do you clean your solar panels? What kind of energy would you be using?
Well, you'd be using a lot of the same things. Number one, electricity coming to you through a powered grid that's fed by energy from areas that have tons of solar and tons of wind. But you can also, there are areas with lots of snow, it's the way, it's how you angle the roof line, how you angle your solar panels, heating coils that run through that panel so the snow drifts off fast, so you're not trying to jump up there and get a shovel and shovel off your panel. We also, there's always capacity and you know, I'm not, Sudbury, do we have any geothermal capacity? I'm looking at Bill or?
We can through the mines.
We can through the mines. One of the coolest things that I discovered on this Community Matters tour was from Indigenous people in Alberta, where, by the way, did you know Alberta right now has 100,000 abandoned oil wells already? 100,000. Some are orphaned, in other words, the corporations that own them run away. Some are abandoned, in other words, we know where the corporations are that drilled them, but they're not paying any attention to them anymore. So it's a toxic legacy of the billions of dollars. But what an Indigenous community west of Alberta figured out was, wait a minute, geothermal. And the estimates are that about 10% of Alberta's deep oil wells, and this would be true as well for old mine sites, but about 10% of Alberta's deep oil wells have enough heat at depth to drive turbines to create electricity. And the biggest expense in geothermal is the drilling. So this has been done because these are abandoned oil wells. So when I look ahead at where we can go and what it looks like, we can't, and as the Green Party, we're not going to be prescriptive and say this is the only kind of technology we like. We think once we're clear that this is the timetable in which we're going off fossil fuels, this is the timetable for building a major improvement to a Canadian grid where each province can feed into the other one and go up to the Northwest Territories. Once we've made it clear that this is the direction we're going, I think a whole bunch of new technologies are going to emerge and compete. But electric vehicles and an electric vehicle charging station network that's coast to coast to coast is going to be an economic revolution that's really quite positive for our society. Not to mention what happens when we retrofit all our buildings and create millions of jobs for plumbers, electricians, people installing insulation, carpenters. We have actually more need for workers than we have available jobs, and renewable energy potential, even in places like here with big winters, it's totally doable, especially when you're backed up by a grid that's being fed by other communities that say, okay, when we have excess, we feed into the grid. When we're short a little bit, we take it out of the grid, and that's how we work towards making sure there's stable, renewable energy all the time. Now, the young man in the back row, do you still have your question? There you are, yeah.
Thank you for coming. This is me. My name is Raymond, and I have 4 comments, 4 questions.
Okay, I'll try not to answer all 4, it'll take too long, but I'll listen to all 4 if you can do them fast.
Yes, for sure. So the first comment is, I'd like to know what the position is on ethanol based on food. My understanding that it's not a good idea. The other comment is, put a lot of attention on greenhouse gases, which is super important, but over the last 30 years, the idea of food security across the world has been put in the back, and it's becoming more of a problem now as we look at the ocean and the loss of land and the loss of water. And also we have also not paid as much attention to the degradation of fresh water with all the green algae. Like, it doesn't seem to be the issues that are just as important. And the last one addresses your social equality, which is very much based on the various forms of tax savings around the world, which the multinationals use to not pay their taxes by the hundreds of billions, which is money that we could use. And it seems that the main parties have always been silent on this across the world. It's really a shame that we don't hear anybody at the federal level taking this seriously.
Thank you, Raymond. I'll answer the questions fast, and I'll start with the last one because I get so upset about the offshore tax havens. We're the only country where where Canadian offshore bank accounts were listed in the Paradise Papers. We're the only country that hasn't gone back to try to get that money. And we can, and we should. And I remember the Auditor General, when it was Sheila Fraser, he would always point at this issue. Why is the CRA, she did many reports, why does the CRA not go after, they've got mathematical formulas that will put them in the direction of where their money is from where big bucks are hiding offshore. And she kept asking in her reports, why does CRA not use this technology to go after big bucks? Why are we going after little folks? The last report from Michael Ferguson, our wonderful Auditor General, just passed away, was a detailed report. I urge any, because I won't go into the details now, go online and try to find the report of that Auditor General's report. It showed in detail how CRA does not ever offer the average Canadian, you owe us this money, but we're going to waive the interest payments because you can see you're having difficulties. They only voluntarily waive interest payments when they're dealing with big transnationals with offshore bank accounts. It showed how they systematically prefer to go after people who have very little money, but they can scare us. They don't want to go after big fat cats offshore who can afford lawyers. So we will keep raising this and go after the money. As far as green algae, and a lot of the toxic blue-green algae is coming about from water contamination, aided and abetted by climate change. Hot weather produces algae. So does runoff from, I mentioned earlier to Chanel's question, the problem of intensive livestock feeding operations. In Manitoba, Lake Winnipeg, I was just campaigning in Manitoba, and Lake Winnipeg is in a terrible state. And a lot of that is because of runoff from agricultural operations, particularly those hog barns, that local farmers tried to stop because they're not really farming. They're factories, and that the pollution is horrific. So we're very concerned about that as well. Quickly to say, back to food security, the focus of the Canadian government, whether they'll ever admit it or not, Agriculture Canada's focus is exporting food from Canada as much as possible. And some of the stuff we export is only, allegedly food. But we are big on exporting it out of the country instead of supporting our local farmers to make an income on farm. Most Canadian farmers can't make an income on farm. They have to have additional jobs off farm. So that's food security is very important. And back to climate change, because that covers off the last two of your points. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from about 2 weeks ago on land and land use pointed to how important it is that we pay attention to regenerative soil in agriculture, how we can store more carbon in our soils, but not under industrial models, not with lots of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. To grow healthy soil, you need organic agriculture, and you need to keep the carbon in the soil and help that soil be healthy and full of living things. So we do need more local food growing, and that ties into Mission Possible. We want to call on Canadians everywhere, just as we did in my parents did in wartime, plant a victory garden. We need more gardens planted in backyards and on rooftops. If you have an apartment building with a green roof, that building will require 25% less air conditioning than if you don't have a green roof. So these things tend to tie together and reinforce. And we are absolutely against growing food crops to turn to ethanol. We do need biodiesel. We can get all the biodiesel we need across Canada for things like, for vehicles that aren't electrified yet, right? Like so fishing boats, forestry equipment, mining equipment. We can get all of the biodiesel we need from wood waste, from vegetable oil waste, all of the fast food joints across this country that have to pay people to take away their used veggie fat are the feedstocks for a biodiesel industry for relatively small production in each community. And that's, so there's a lot of really cool solutions that help close the loop on things that we now think of as waste. But we should never be growing food for the purpose of wasting all that energy to convert it to ethanol. That never made any sense. So I'm just looking around. I've got two hands. I'm going to go to you, and I'm going to go to the gentleman in the back, and okay.
So Elizabeth, since we're on the campus of Laurentian University, can you talk about post-secondary tuition and the party's plan for student debt? And I don't know if you're aware, but we're the only G20 country that does not have a federal minister of education. Is that something that the party could look at since they help fund post-secondary education?
That's a really good, so did that question carry? Talking about Canada's the only G8 country.
G20.
The only G20 country without a federal minister of education. Well, of course, what we've done in Canada, of course, our Constitution treats education as a provincial issue. But I do want to speak to the post-secondary question. The statistics, the evidence around the life chances of our children around the economy start with they've got a lot of student debt. Housing is out of reach, and we're in a gig economy. Unlike when I was a kid and finished law school, you get a job in law firm, you're going to be there a really long time. So we need to address a lot of the things that make life harder for the younger generation. There's for those of you who are part of that generation, I recommend to you an organization called Generation Squeeze. Professor Paul Kershaw from UBC started it up after he started assembling the evidence that you're basically, well, you're screwed. So, sorry. We're going to fix it, but in the meantime, the evidence is really clear if you're dealing with people who don't understand how unfair it is that the generation of Canadians between 18 and 35 have it much worse than we did. Well, I'm older than you are, but
Not much.
so what we need to, what Gen Squeeze is a great source of data, and I work with Paul Kershaw, and one of the first things we have to do is eliminate tuition and post-secondary. Universities and colleges, we can do this, many countries around the world do this. Yeah, we can eliminate tuition. And we can eliminate student debt, including existing student debt. Now that takes the work, we have to go back. So, I haven't mentioned this before, but our whole budget for the platform for the 2019 campaign is currently being costed and assessed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. So we won't release a platform where we can't prove that yes, we found the money to do all the things we say we can do, and if we became government, we could do the things we say we can do because we've actually figured out how we're going to pay for it. So we want to go back over a period of years and ensure that no Canadian has a debt load of more than $10,000 as a result of their education. So that's our cutoff is $10,000. And then we're also going to make sure that the universities and colleges in this country get an infusion of cash through federal provincial transfers that are earmarked for only post-secondary universities and colleges. Because the reason the universities have raised tuition is that they've been starved of money. And we don't have people who just finished their PhDs. They're not seeing tenure track positions opened up for getting hired. They may be the most exploited group of workers in the country. Our recent PhD grads who have a huge student debt and are offered $6,000 a course per semester to teach in a university. So we need to fund our universities properly. We need to take it very seriously that is an investment. Investing in having the smartest, best educated population in the world is an investment. It's not a cost. And we should never, ever scrimp on letting every brain expand as far as it wants to expand to figure out how to do new cool things. So thank you. And then there was back up there to you, sir. And there's now more seats opening up down here if anyone wants to come sit down. And you can all see that, but I do encourage you to find a comfy seat. Yes, sir.
I'm hoping to get help me understand this platform better.
Okay.
The parties received some criticism over not being contemporary or comprehensive enough. And honestly, like a lot of what I hear when you talk concerns me in that regard. Like the concept of social cohesion, I agree with Grady, but we don't have that in Canada. We have relations with Indigenous communities. Golden Bush didn't have social cohesion, and the response we had after Saskatchewan didn't represent that. So you speak of us, right, and you speak of a family, and you speak of UNDRIP and solidarity. So can you help me understand how that's operationalized in the platform?
Yeah. I didn't get your name.
Joseph.
What was your first? Sorry, I didn't hear it again. Joseph. Look, first of all, I'm really proud of our platform and our policies, and they come from an Indigenous caucus within the party. And I know there was an article that came from someone that I think misrepresented what we stand for. So I'll just say that really clearly. But I don't disagree with anything else you said. Certainly, there is an us, there is a family, and there is deep injustice. We completely adopt all the recommendations
of the recent inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. We know, by the way, that one of the recommendations is our existing policy for guarantees of the link. The key factor, the structural justice that constituted genocide found by the inquiry, was the first leader to say that is absolutely right. I did take the time to read the volume that dealt with the use of the word genocide and why it was used. That was 200 pages of a 1,200-page report, and I'm still working through all the elements of the report. But our policy on Indigenous people is really clear, and it starts with, if we're going to talk nation, it has to speak of nations that self-identify, not what a colonial and oppressive race of act like the Indian Act tells people they're allowed to call a nation. Right? So we need to move with self-government.
Acknowledge that only Indigenous people are the nation. I mean, the Inuit do not want to be described as a nation. Métis want to be described First Nations as created under the Indian Act. As one of my friends who's the chief of Sartlet First Nation, which is in the area that I'm honored to represent in Parliament, he says, look, under the Indian Act, you got 4 First Nations in your riding, except that as far as we're concerned, those are 4 villages within the Saanich Nation. And I'm an Indian Act chief trying to get myself out of a job because that's not our governance system. We're a matrilineal culture. Our decisions are based on family houses, etc. If you look at the Wet'suwet'en, they still have, which is a tribute to resilience, they still have a system of hereditary chiefs, and they know who their chiefs are. Those hereditary chiefs are the system of governance that we want to recognize. So backing up, we're the only party that has renounced the doctrine of discovery. We're the only party that has said really clearly we need to get past the Indian Act, but then it becomes hard. How do you do it? You can't do it without full consultation with Indigenous peoples affected by the Indian Act. So we're going with the approach that what we need to do is recognize that we want to get rid of the Indian Act because, as a settler culture Canadian, I find it offensive that we have a fundamental piece of legislation that is racist, that the South Africans used to model apartheid on our legislation. But I also recognize you can't just snap your fingers because you've got a lot of communities that say, look, our rights are derived through the Indian Act. We don't know how do we govern ourselves in the Indian Act is suddenly gone. So we want to move in the direction of as many Indigenous, self-determined decisions on what is a nation, what is a territory, who is part of our nation. We decide as Indigenous peoples under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People who is part of our nation, and then opt out, create situations for Indigenous nations to opt out of the Indian Act as they determine they want to do so. And if they want to stay in, they do. But the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is, from our point of view as Greens, not negotiable. We have to bring it in and make it our law across the country. So that's I could go on and on. I was the only leader who showed up when the Assembly of First Nations asked for every leader to come to the annual general meeting in July to talk about what our platform is. And I said it was much longer than what I've shared with you tonight, but it was overwhelmingly well received, and I'm very touched by that. Yeah. So there's a young woman down here in the front. Yes. Oh, quick follow. Okay. Okay, I'll go back to Joseph.
So you have recognized title sovereignty, self-governance.
Mm-hmm.
Would you support an Indigenous nation to opt out of Canada?
That's a choice for an Indigenous nation to make, and it's a very good question whether they're in Canada or whether we've occupied Turtle Island. So, yeah, I would certainly, I think, but from the negotiations and the discussion, I mean, that's really it's a really interesting question. No one's ever put it to me. But to adopt what I believe is true, the answer has to be yes. Yes, what's your name?
Melissa.
Melissa, thanks.
So just in regards to what you were I was actually going to ask a question in regards to if you were to abolish the Indian Act, how you would ensure inherent and treaty rights are respected, including the right to refuse projects on traditional and reserve lands, including like green energy projects.
Yeah.
And you answered a bit of that. So instead, I was going to ask the second question. How would you go about implementing traditional government systems, and more specifically, how would you address like the overrepresentation child welfare system? And when you would implement the self-government system, how would you go about bringing all of our children home?
Right. So Melissa's question was going to be around some of the same things Joseph asked, but I'm just repeating it because her voice is soft. I'm not sure you heard up there. In terms of the inherent rights and treaty rights, and just really clearly the way that the current government is interpreting prior informed consent and consultations on prior informed consent appears to be we're going to consult with you till you agree with us. And it's the opposite of prior informed consent. In any case, the question she moved to is what do we do about the number of Indigenous children in foster care in the child welfare system? And I'm sure, I think probably a lot of you know that we now have more Indigenous children caught up in the government child welfare system than we had Indigenous children in residential schools. So so the 60 scoop is not necessarily the same thing now, but it's really a lot the same. So you have a lot of Indigenous children taken away from their families. You have a lot of children being in very vulnerable conditions, especially when they age out of wherever they are and they're not in a place with good social networks, with their families, with their elders, with supports. So number one, guaranteed livable income. A lot of the children, let's face it, children are being taken from their parents because their parents are poor. If everybody had a guaranteed livable income, the number of it's heartbreaking, the number of children taken away from their parents. And supports, the social workers who are busy taking away children should be doing good social work, like supporting families staying together, as opposed to taking children away from their parents. So it starts with economic stability. I don't mean to simplify this. There is the intergenerational reality of what residential schools did. There is trauma, there is PTSD, there are a lot of issues that are not going to be wished away or pretended away. But it starts with respect. It starts with, and Cindy Blackstock's work on behalf of the Child and Family Caring Society, all of those rulings by the Human Rights Commissions, and the government is still fighting them. So we need to ensure that every child in Canada, whether they're settler culture Canadian, refugee child, or an Indigenous child, has a good start in life, good roof over your head, proper food, proper care, proper support, and recognizing that taking a child away from their parents is a trauma, and we should not be doing it. So we did pass in Parliament this spring new legislation around the best interests of the child in Indigenous contexts. It may help, I hope it does, but it's likely, so far, as long as we ignore the problem of poverty, we're not going to get to a solution. But so I'm seeing if I missed anybody. Yes, in the middle there, yes.
Thank you for being here. Carol.
Hi, Carol.
I have a question about the carbon tax. Can you clarify, I understand the Green Party supports it.
Yeah.
Can you clarify how your support of it differs from the other parties and what successful messaging we could do about it?
Yeah. I was just having a really interesting conversation about this earlier today because, anyway, we've always called for carbon pricing. The Green Party model is something called carbon fee and dividend, where we would collect the carbon pollution fee from the bigger polluters because really, one of the problems with the way this issue is discussed is the impression that every Canadian is to blame, we're all equally guilty. There's a handful of big corporations that are mostly responsible. Canada would be very much on track to meet the wheat target we currently have if it weren't for the growth in fossil fuel production in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Ontario has already done a lot in reducing its CO2, but it doesn't show up on the ledger because we're swamped by big pollution. So the way the fee and dividend would work is to collect the carbon price from polluters, and all of us pollute a bit, for sure, some more than others, but then the money that's collected would be redistributed in actual checks sent to every Canadian on a per capita basis, but not back to the big polluters. So they have a very big incentive to reduce their pollution, and every Canadian would have, particularly, it would be very progressive in terms of the tax system, because lower income Canadians would find that check more valuable than higher income earners, particularly if you're a student and don't own a car and you're getting a check in the mail because it's your fair share per capita of carbon pricing. We also see that particular model as being a good way of getting people used to the idea of guaranteed livable income, that you're going to get a check in the mail that makes it possible for you to live not well, but enough next to the poverty line that you can get out of poverty and keep working. We try to explain that we actually, even though the current Liberal government approach isn't the way we would have designed it, but I voted for it because it's a step in the right direction. By itself, without lots of other government policies, it can't get us where we need to go. It can get us quite far, depending on how much they want to increase the price of the carbon tax. I think that the Liberals also promised to eliminate subsidies. We're still handing billions of dollars to fossil fuel companies, and we shouldn't. They promised, but actually Stephen Harper promised he would end that practice in 2009. Justin Trudeau promised it again in 2015. We've actually increased subsidies to fossil fuels in the period of time we're supposed to get off of them. So that's basically, if you look at Mission Possible on our website, you'll see that, in big, bold, exciting ideas, we have lots that are, including planting billions of trees everywhere. We've got gardens, we've got moving off of internal combustion engines. A lot of this is driven by the new technology and by a lot of volunteer effort and the notion that it's all hands on deck. I think will really make our society, more vibrant and mobilized and encouraged by knowing there's a role for everybody, because people who are paying attention to the climate science are somewhat paralyzed by, oh my gosh, this is huge, what can I do? But if we give everybody something to do, it will be very positive. Carbon taxes play a role for sure. In terms of messaging, I don't know. I tend to think that what we have to do is explain to people how serious the issue is, because the debates around carbon taxes in Parliament have been really they've been more like a Punch and Judy show than an actual discussion, and that worries me. I don't want this next election to be a bunch of people saying, Trudeau's creating this big carbon tax and he's rich and it's not fair to us. I mean, the carbon tax is it's dwarfed by the normal fluctuations that occur when the oil companies have a glut or don't have a glut and the price of gas fluctuates. It's a relatively small component of what we pay at the pump. What we want to do is move away from the pump and get away from being dependent on fossil fuels altogether. And that isn't a clear message yet from anybody except us. So that's a short answer, Carol. I hope that's okay. And okay, there was one other, yes, the lady in the striped shirt, yes.
My name is Kristen, and I have a question. Sudbury is not extremely well connected or at all by rail, even though it has somewhat of a bus service. Would the Green Party make any strides in making it a federally connected public transportation system better than by rail?
It's essential that we do it. And it's one of the takeaways from my experience of going to all these communities, like in BC, everyone's saying, oh my gosh, we lost Greyhound service. Everybody thinks it's a localized problem that you can't get in a rural and remote community. You can't get to a lot of places you should be able to get to conveniently and affordably. So rail needs to be vastly improved. Via rail should be a key backbone to our system with daily travel. And on better rails, if we built, and there are many parts of Canada where if we built 10 kilometers of track to avoid a pinch point where freight tends to force passenger rail onto a siding so they can pass 5 hours later, because the tracks in this country are owned by CN and CP for the most part, and they're not, and VIA has to lease them, and the traffic light, if you get a red light and you're a VIA engineer, you can't argue with it, right? So the control of the tracks is on freight to make sure that goods run on time and people wait on the siding. We can vastly improve our rail system and go to electric trains, but that's just one piece of a system where then you should have light rail spokes off of the VIA rail backbone and electric buses that ensure that people from any part of Canada can get decent public transit at an affordable price to get where they need to go. which is another one of the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report in the inquiry, is how vulnerable people are when you can't afford to get anywhere except for hitchhiking. But I also heard on the other side of the country in New Brunswick, where they've now changed their hospital system so certain hospitals specialize in certain illnesses. So if you happen to live in Bathurst, New Brunswick, and you have a heart problem, you may have to go all the way to St. John, New Brunswick to see a doctor. There's no bus service anymore. There's virtually no train service. And unless you own your own car, even then it's perilous in winter to be driving to a doctor's appointment over those long. So a modern industrialized country like Canada cannot function without taking care to have a transit system that works for everyone. So yes, big cities need good, efficient subways, light rail, buses, everything. But rural and remote communities also have a right to be able to live in a modern industrialized country that has at least as good bus service as Mexico, right? I don't know if you've ever been to a developing country, you walk down a laneway, you wait a while, a bus will come. That doesn't happen in much of Canada, not in Atlantic Canada, not in Saskatchewan, not in BC, and I understand you have somewhat of a bus system here. Well, it needs to be vastly improved. Now I'm watching time, and I'm noting that it's been almost 8:30, and we started at 7. We can go a little bit later. So I see the hand of the lady there on the staircase, the young man in the back, and the last questioner will be there. Yes, I can just barely make you out from here. My weak old eyes. Where? Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, then we'll go 1, then we'll go 2, then we'll go 3, then we'll go 4. So you first, sir. Did you want a question too? You did? Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Stuart, and I'm a local farmer here in Sudbury. And you mentioned earlier about food availability and food accessibility and those kinds of things. And we work really hard on a small acreage farm to produce as much food as we can. My business has expanded to just triple the size it was a couple of years ago. And I'm looking to remove any possibility of using fossil fuels on my farm. So I've talked to Elon Musk actually, personally, and I asked him to build an electric tractor. Okay, and if we could get all of the farmers in Canada off diesel and gasoline powered tractors, we could reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which I mentioned is the 4th largest industry in Canada. Also, we need a reasonable income for small farms. Factory farms just don't cut it. People are turning away from factory farms and grocery store produced foods, and they're turning towards the local small farmer to get the high quality, nutritious food, fresh and picked at its peak. Okay, rather than importing food from Chile and Mexico and all over the world. So how can we, as a Green Party, encourage expansion of small local farms and help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions through the production of electric tractors?
Well, this was an excellent question, and there was a lot of richness to it. You probably couldn't hear it back. But Stuart is a farmer, and he's been trying to make sure that that farms and food security are a priority. His own farm has expanded 3 times lately. He wants to get off fossil fuels. He actually managed, I want the story, how he called Elon Musk personally to ask if he could get an electric tractor. I spoke earlier of what I think is an interim step, which is biodiesel, which can be made from, just to give you a concrete example, near Owen Sound, Ontario, there's a biodiesel producer that produces biodiesel from stale baited base cell margarine. That's just one source, and they're able to provide that, but biodiesel can be produced locally in small facilities that meet local needs. What else can we do? We need to make sure, and there's a weirdness to Canada's regulatory system. We over-regulate small business and small farmers, and if you're a really big corporation, you just walk away and ignore the regulations. So we need to release and to really encourage local agriculture. We need to, and this is provincial jurisdiction, so I'm getting to dangerous territory, but it drives me a little crazy how much regulation and over-regulation there is of farm gate sales, of making sure that a local food producer can sell food locally to people who really want it, as you say, fresh, picked at its right moment. So we need to, one thing we have in our Green Party platform is to pay farmers for the things they do for ecological services. So farmers who are practicing agriculture that regenerates the soil and stores carbon should receive a benefit from that. Farmers who are making sure that their hedgerows, I mean, that's one thing Harper did to the prairies, was get rid of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, which was put there after the Dust Bowl to make sure we didn't lose soil. They got rid of that. I can't think of why now that we're facing massive droughts. But there's a lot we can do to ensure that farmers on the land can produce decent food that Canadians want. One of the other things we'll do is to work with the supermarket chains to say you must have a portion of your shelf space for local food. They tend to prefer the single contract, even with the organic agriculture. How organic is it really if it's broccoli from California that you know is grown in massive, intensive ways because Loblaws or whatever the store chain is wants to have something that's uniform and available year-round. We also have to get back to thinking about off-season root cellars, thinking about some things you can't get all year round. But in any case, supporting local farmers, I hope will come through to farmers from our platform is a big commitment from us. So now, who did I miss? I was going to the lady on the staircase next. Yeah.
A lot of the rocks in your treaty in 1850, and luckily the Canadian government did not dispute the whole negotiation that's happening now. Ford obviously did. Do you have any Indigenous candidates in Robinson Bureau Treaty or Treaty 9 or any of the Northern Ontario?
I'm not 100% sure because we haven't finished all our nominations. We have quite a few Indigenous candidates across Canada. I was with our one Inuk candidate who's running in northern Quebec, former chief of Cowichan Nation and running Cowichan land. So I don't want to start itemizing in my head. Do you know if we have any Indigenous in our Canada? We don't know. We haven't finished all the nominations. Who would be very grateful to be put in touch with them because we do want as many, we have Métis, First Nations, and as I said, one Inuit representative so far on our candidate slate. And it has been the Indigenous, Lorraine Rackman's is Serpent River First Nation, but she's not running in Serpent River First Nation territory, she's running closer to Ottawa. So thinking of people from the top of my head and admitting that I'm getting a little tired, I don't know for sure, but please do get in touch with us if you know of any Indigenous candidates willing to run or consider it or just talk to us so we can try to talk them into it. So, young man back here.
Hi, my name is Tomas. I go to Laurentian University, and last year I ran in the SGA elections, which is a student union at Laurentian, and we saw really bad voter turnout. All you have to do is click the email link vote. You only have to get off the couch to go vote. So my question to you is, given that the Conservative government might benefit on a younger generation not voting, how are you going to get the young generation? What's the strategy to get a younger generation up and off the couch and get to the polls? Because the Snapchat, like swipe ups, don't work.
Okay. Thanks, Tomas. Right now, 37% of Canadian voters in this election are between 18 and 38.
Yep.
That's the biggest chunk of voters are, well, from your point of view, 38 isn't young, I get that. We're just really like this. Never mind. But we do need young people to vote. Now in 2015, for the health of democracy is what I mean, in 2015, voter turnout among young people went up substantially. And even though a couple 100,000 people didn't get to vote because of the law Harper had in place about not allowing people to vouch for each other and so on, voter turnout went up because of the efforts at youth voting. I'm certain of it. So groups like Apathy is Boring, I don't know if you've heard of them, work specifically at peer-to-peer, young people encouraging other young people to vote. I think that's, Elections Canada has a mandate now to have more advanced polls, more convenient, taking place on campus to make it more convenient. But one of the things that Apathy is Boring did in 2015 was have vote mobs, have group activities, have people talking about going and voting together. If any of you are professors at the university, I urge you to make your classroom lesson one day when you know that there's an advanced poll on campus. Say today you're getting full credit, stand up, walk out, let's go vote. We need to get every single person to vote that we possibly can and to know that you can vote for what you want. But without, low voter turnout among young people, it will impact young people the most because unless we address the climate crisis, your future is looking pretty unpleasant. If we do address the climate crisis, it's a very bright, engaged, exciting one. And I don't know how else we get people to vote other than talking to each person one at a time. Every time somebody, if I'm in a restaurant and someone's getting my second cup of coffee, I stop to ask, what's your name? Do you vote? It's amazing how often people say, well, I actually don't want to talk to me, I've never voted. And I can usually talk them into voting. So it's really a question of that direct contact, one person at a time, asking someone. The person taking your groceries at the store and scanning them. Of course, this is all lining up. I hate the idea that what's going to eventually happen is we don't have anybody at the grocery stores because it's just going to take a claw to scan things. It's just, we're contributing to our own obsolescence when we go along with all these barcode things. But that's a small rant, I apologize. We do need to speak to absolutely everyone we see and ask if they plan to vote, have they voted before, do they know how to register to vote, and if you possibly can, make a plan to help them out to vote, because every vote is going to count, particularly the votes from young people. So I'm going to go, the last question was to the gentleman in the back there, yeah. Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah. In Ontario, we kind of have a case of two provinces, where in Southern Ontario, we're making tons of jobs, but then there's also skyrocketing demand for housing to the point where the families on top of each other just be able to afford a house. Meanwhile, in Sudbury, if you drive a couple hours north of Sudbury, they're basically giving houses away. Now, despite that, most young people are moving down south for job opportunities. The market itself is not able to spread out the work. So what is the federal Green Party committed to doing to even it out so that we're not piling tons of people on one side and then leave empty lots on the other side?
Well, it's a great question. There's no one simple answer, but part of what we want to do is in the context of just transition for fossil fuel sector workers is create some job banks so people can see where the opportunities are, because the workers in the fossil fuel industry are skilled workers. It won't take long to either slightly transfer or upskill a bit to move to a new job. But right now, Canada overall, what I hear from employers is they can't find skilled workers. I don't hear from employers that they don't have jobs enough for the people in the community. So we need to get the balance right. I think a lot of what I saw happening here in Sudbury today, which is so exciting, is a number of new small businesses starting up. A lot of entrepreneurs are getting going, creating jobs here in the community. People who are able to imagine that you can own your own home here and start a business and live here. You're a leg up on the places where you can't afford a house no matter how hard you work. So it has to start with understanding where we have skill shortages and where we have the jobs and try to correct for the mismatch. Because there are still jobs, as far as I got the sense today in Sudbury, there are people being trained up for mining jobs. Nationally, there's a big shortage of mining engineers. There's also there's skilled shortages in most sectors. There's a big shortage of airline pilots. There's a big shortage of early childhood educators. There's a big shortage of French language school teachers. I could go on and on, but it's getting the skills matched to where the jobs are available. And I think a jobs bank can help do that so people know where they can go for the jobs. And for people who are, as you say, one on top of the other in Toronto, a lot of the new economy is remote. You can, if you're doing graphic designs, if you're doing a lot of the skilled innovations that can be sold over the internet, you can communicate fast, you can eat just as much as if you were in a big community. Some of the businesses I toured today are here just because their CEOs and founders like being in this part of the world. So we need to figure out how we can let that word down to people who can't afford a house in Toronto, but maybe they ought to be coming up to Sudbury and starting life here where it's so good for raising kids and you've got lots of opportunities to own your own home and it's a really great community. Some of the areas of Canada just need to, and this is true right across Canada, there are so many areas that are depopulated and housing isn't a problem, but people who might want to take advantage of it don't even know about it. So figuring out through communication and making sure that employers have help in finding the skilled labor they need, because I think that's a bigger problem than people who want to find employment and can't find it, as a national statement, not for any one localized condition. So I'm really well aware that I've now gone over by about 10 minutes. I want to double check with Bill. Is there any hand that you've seen that I should have noticed that's been very persistent? Are you sure?
It's okay.
Okay, I'll stick around if anyone wants to. Oh, yes. You had a question?
Yeah, so just a few clarifications on things you said.
Okay.
Firstly, with the abolition of tuition.
Yeah.
Does that include international students, which would bring us in line with the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or does that not include?
Our current policy is that it's for Canadians, but we would be reducing the tuition because a lot of the international students are paying too much. We also want to improve their pathway to citizenship once they've come here.
Okay. The next one, you mentioned getting rid of combustion engines.
Yeah.
Do you specifically mean eliminating the sale of new combustion engines or completely removing all current ones from the road?
Over time, we'd start with banning the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030, and then we would work on a buyback program and getting rid of internal combustion engines altogether. By the way, I don't know how many of you know that India has already decided that they're banning the sale of internal combustion engines starting in 2022. So things are happening around the world that you wouldn't necessarily know. Yeah, why?
So then, you were also talking about the CRA, how there's a lot of corporate taxes aren't paid. This year alone, the estimated difference between the tax rate and the actual amount of taxes paid is about $11 million. What would the Green Party actually do with the Income Tax Act and all tax acts in order to make sure that that $11 million is actually being paid and people aren't finding loopholes?
Well, we need to, and to the question what we would do about our income tax system, one thing we want to do is have, it's been a long, long time, decades, since we've had a tax commission. Our current tax code, any accountants in the room, our current tax code is so layered with complexity and boutique tax cuts that have been added over the years. We want to do a root and branch tax reform. We want a progressive tax system. We're not going to increase taxes on, we're certainly not increasing taxes on most Canadians, but we do want to create a tax on wealth, which means going after capital gains, exemptions, and loopholes. And we want to also tax, just on that, we want to tax Amazon, Netflix, Google, Airbnbs, all of these virtual, we thought they were benign, but they're pretty malevolent forces, and they don't pay taxes in Canada, and they're hollowing out our newspaper industry and so on. So that, and the other place we're looking at taxing, oh, this is so much fun. I've crunched all the numbers on this. Do you know Stephen Harper gave the banks billions of dollars in 2008 to help them cope with the financial crisis? So we're going to take that back, and we're going to tax the commercial banks. I just can't wait for everybody to see our platform. Some of the things we thought up in the Parliamentary Budget Office crunched the numbers, and they said, some of them we thought, well, that's going to be so many $billion, and the PBO looks at it and says, no, actually, that's twice as much. Okay, well, that means we can, for instance, make sure that the mining industry innovation cluster gets funded, so that'll be good, that's based here in Sudbury. There are other things we can do across the country, from getting rid of tuition and bringing in pharmacare that no one mentioned yet today, but we're definitely going to bring in pharmacare. What, did you have one last one?
Yeah, and the final one is mentioned the gig economy. What would the Green Party actually do in order to prevent businesses from over-relying on short-term, say, one-year contracts that don't have room for improvement, and also independent contractors? We have big companies like Uber, where independent contractors, lo and behold, turns out they might not even be making minimum wage.
Yeah, the gig economy is a real challenge. So is artificial intelligence that's coming at us. to buttress our society against these, and the world of work is gonna change. We can't insist that people employ people beyond one-year contracts, the jobs of, I mean, the things that people are employed doing now I've never heard of when I was in school. So, yeah, my son-in-law was an author on a search engine optimizer for real estate companies. Really? I mean, when I was in college, it wasn't a thing. So we want to make sure that people are insulated from changes in the world of work, particularly artificial intelligence, through guarantees of livable income. We want to maybe talk about a society where if people don't have to work, I mean, this is weird, right? If robots are going to do the work, what do?
Yep.
Well, let's make sure we have really meaningful lives, grow gardens, take up whatever it needs to be to make sure we're taking care of our families and have a society where maybe we make decisions about making our own business, our own opportunities, or going to work for others as needed. And maybe there's still jobs that'll be wonderful, starting a company, creating jobs for others, and being in it for your whole career. But things are so fluid that I can't dictate what it's going to look like. I just know I want to make sure that we plan ahead so Canadians are well educated, out of debt, and have a roof over your head and enough money to figure out what you do next without feeling stressed. Once we do those things, the world of work and the way it changes, smart, creative people who are prepared for it will jump at the opportunities that they create for themselves.
Doubt why Elizabeth is the leader of a federal party in this country. I think we've thrown that out completely.
I still doubt. I have no idea. It was just bad luck.
Bad luck for you, good luck for us.
I love what I'm doing. I'm just kidding around. Honestly, thank you for your patience. Thank you for those of you who stayed through a long discussion. I've gotten some new ideas. It's really, really helpful. And I want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for taking your evening to give us a chance. That's all I'm asking. Thank you.